My name is Eliana Rabinowitz. I'm a level 3 judge currently in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I just looking real quick, everything's good. Okay, yeah. So I'm really, really excited to give this presentation. A little over a year ago, I wrote an article about rules and policy, and I think 11 people read it, not very many. But when this conference came up, Isaac asked if I would be willing to turn it into a presentation, and I was super excited about the article, and I'm super excited about this presentation. I think it's going to be pretty fun. Couple things. First of all, I am monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, I will happily take those in the chat. And I will get to those questions the best that I can. And then the second thing is, this presentation is going to assume a certain amount of knowledge of the IPG and the comp rules. So nothing super specific. Like if you don't know the rules and the policy like super thoroughly, that's going to be okay. But you do need to be like familiar with generally what they are, because otherwise some of the stuff isn't going to make sense. And so with that, onward we go. So to start off, let me talk about why I decided to do this presentation and why I decided to write the article that it's based on in the first place. So I saw a lot of conversations like this, like, oh, hey, here's this rules question. And someone saying, on the Facebook group or whatever, no, that doesn't work. And someone saying, well, that's not intuitive, that's dumb. And then someone else saying, well, that's how the rules work, deal with it. Doesn't matter if it makes sense. And I found that to be like a very unhelpful sort of conversation. And some of these others might also look familiar. So this could be a conversation at an event. So here's a question about the IPG. And then the answer is, that's just how policy is. This is how you memorize it. This is what policy is. You absolutely need to stick to it, blah, blah, blah. Very kind of focused on policy as an objective thing, which it is when you're a floor judge at an event. You do need to follow policy, but there's just so much more to it. The other one that I hear a lot is this argument. You should deviate. No, never deviate. This happens quite a lot. And so I saw a lot of these conversations, and I decided that those conversations were not really getting at the heart of kind of the philosophy behind why we have the rules and policy that we have. And I think that we can have a lot less argumentative discussion and a lot more productive discussion about what our rules and policy are if we understand the philosophy behind what they do. And so I come from a math background, and I came with this kind of structure of why the rules and policy are the way they are that I think is kind of illustrative if it's not something that you're used to. And yeah, so first we'll talk about the comp rules, then we'll talk about the IPG policy, and hopefully you'll come out of it at least thinking a little bit more about why rules and policy are the way they are. So yeah, here we go. So the first thing that you have to do to understand kind of what the structure that we're working with here to have rules be the way that they need to be, essentially, is we need to understand what they're trying to do. And in this structure, there are kind of three things that we need the comp rules to be. So we need them to be intuitive, we need them to be complete, and we need them to be learnable. And because we're going to go into some precision here, I am going to define those for you and kind of talk about what they are. So rules that are intuitive are going to always yield the same answer that people think is right or makes sense as much as possible. So when they hear a ruling from the comp rules, like, oh, this is the way this interaction between these cards work, it needs to essentially make sense. It needs to be right. And the reason for that is that the game is much less fun if it feels like super arbitrary what the rules are doing, right? So it needs to work basically the way players expect them to work. And so there's something interesting about this, which is it's provable that you actually can't have a set of rules that is 100% stone cold intuitive, right? And here's the proof of that. So you have two cards here, Abrupt Decay, Rest in Peace. A lot of you have probably seen this rules interaction, right? So you Abrupt Decay the Rest in Peace. Well, what happens? And so I know a lot of you know what does happen in this situation. What I want to hear from you about is what you think is intuitive, so what you think should happen. And I think what we'll get is, if people want to type that in the chat, or even if you're just thinking about it. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying neither. And when I've talked to a lot of other players, a lot of people think kind of they both should be exiled, or like one or both. There's a lot of confusion essentially about what should happen in this case. There's a lot of people who feel very strongly that what they think should happen is intuitive, but there are different people who think different things for that. And so it's really interesting, right? Because you were saying here that we really want a rules system that that's intuitive to people, but you can't have a rule system that is intuitive completely, because no matter what you make this ruling, just this ruling in isolation, there are going to be people who say it's unintuitive every single time. And so I think that's really interesting, right? It tells you something about how intuitive we can actually make this. Yeah, and so someone's saying they think it's hard to consider something else intuitive when you understand why this happens. Yes. So a lot of this is from the perspective of people who have not spent a ton of time studying the rules. And the reason why is that most people who play Magic are not judges. Most people who play Magic don't even look at the comp rules, they don't think about the comp rules. Their friend taught them how to play. And so when we talk about what the rules should be in terms of being intuitive, it's not just for judges, right? It's also for players. And so the next kind of characteristic we want the comp rules to have is we want them to be complete. And so all that means is that every interaction or question needs to have a definite answer according to the rules. So when I point this out to people, people go, well, obviously, right? Because it would be super awkward to have an interaction that just has no ruling whatsoever. And so you call a judge to the table, you say, hey, I cast this spell targeting this thing, what happens? And the judge goes, I don't know, the comp rule doesn't say. Uh, we just have to figure out the best we can. That would be really strange, right, for a competitive game. Well, we certainly think it would be as people who are into Magic, but actually there are other games that are pretty pretty reasonably competitive that actually very much don't have completeness. So in the Warhammer FAQs, the first question in the FAQ is the most important rule, they call it, and it's just, if there's no answer that presents itself, then try to discuss it with your opponent. And if you can't figure something out, then roll a die. Whoever rolls higher gets to choose. Hooray, let's fight. Um, yeah, exactly. So that's, an example of a game that is played competitively, but does not have completeness. There's also a Star Trek game that's, I could not find the game itself to save my life, but I remember that in the rules it says, if a dispute cannot be resolved from reference to these rules, you discuss the issue and come to a solution in the spirit of Starfleet. Uh, so, that's not exactly the most transparent rule. It's not exactly the most complete rule in the entire world. I suppose you could do a lot of arguing about what exactly is the spirit of Starfleet. But yeah, so there are actually a lot of games that aren't complete, but I think it's pretty clear that we want the rules of Magic to be complete, or at least as close to complete as they possibly can be, right? Because otherwise that's going to create a pretty negative competitive experience. And then the last one of these characteristics is learnable. And that just means that a dedicated individual needs to be able to comprehend and retain the rules. And that also seems really important, right? So let's say, for just thought's sake, that there are 20,000 unique Magic cards, and there are actually more than that now, I believe. Let's say that interactions only happen between exactly 2 cards at a time, never with themselves. And that's obviously also not true. But even in this very, very simple scenario here where we're trying to count interactions, we still have over 199 million interactions that would require separate rulings if we were to just list them all out. And that doesn't include interactions with more than 2 cards, interactions of cards with themselves, or any new cards that continue to get printed. Yeah, so that's obviously something that would be problematic, right? And so we need systems that are going to generalize to multiple situations because nobody is going to memorize uh, nine, you know, almost 200 million interactions. And it's so many more than that because of how simplified this calculation was, right? So you can't just list all the interactions here. Uh, Someone's saying challenge accepted, but I would urge you not to do that because the average lifespan of a human is not nearly long enough to even like comprehend that many rulings, I don't think. So yeah. So then you get this question of, well, do we need all three of these things? Because they seem to kind of conflict with each other sometimes. And so let's say that we want to be as intuitive as we can be. And remember, we can't be all the way intuitive, but we can like strive to be as intuitive as we can be. And then also complete, right? So also have rulings for everything. Well, that's just billions of rulings, right? It's you take every interaction, you figure out what's intuitive, you list it down on the piece of paper, and you continue on. And so that is a bad thing, right? We probably don't want that. Then let's say, so I guess we might need learnable here, right? So let's say that we take intuitive still. So we still want to be as intuitive as we can be, and we want learnable, but maybe not complete. And that's where we get things like resolve disputes as they make sense in the spirit of Ugin, the spirit dragon. He's wise, right? Obviously, that's not going to work for a competitive game like this. But there you go. And so then you say, well, maybe it's intuitive that we can drop. And you say, well, what if it's complete and learnable? And then you can just say like, oh, always timestamps, no layers, nothing else, absolutely always timestamps. Well, if that's true, then you're going to enjoy some really, really strange interactions. Because then, so for example here, if you have a chromatic lantern and then you play a Magus of the Moon, currently Layers says that, well, uh, because Magus of the Moon changes the type of the lands and then Chromatic Lantern applies the ability, the lands still get to tap for all the colors. And that is intuitive because Chromatic Lantern applies to all lands, even if they're mountains. So it's kind of weird to think that Magus of the Moon would impact that, right? So Layers kind of fixes this interaction. But if you just go huff timestamps, then Magus of the Moon is going to turn off that ability. And that's kind of weird. And there's other situations too where if you're just like always timestamps, nothing else, blah blah blah, then you're gonna end up with a lot of unintuitive interactions, and this is only like the tip of the iceberg as far as that's concerned. And so, what do we actually do? I see that this did not line up exactly, but so what are we going to do here? And so my kind of thoughts about what the comp rules are doing and what we're trying to do here uh, is is that we want to make things as intuitive as they can be, but obviously they can't be all the way intuitive. So that's why I have like the little arrow there. But then we also want to get the rules as complete as possible and as learnable as possible while keeping the intuition as high as we can. And this creates this kind of goofy balance that actually explains a lot about how the why the rules are how they are. So ultimately we need to rely on a lot of generalizations. If we want it to be complete and we want it to be learnable, then we need generalizations, but intuitive is actually what controls how fine-grained those generalizations end up being. And so you get a couple different kinds of complainers here, right, about what the comp rules are. So you get complexity complainers, and those people are the ones that go, magic rules are too complicated. Oh my god, it's so complicated. They value the rules being learnable over the rules being intuitive. They don't care that the layer system fixes this interaction. They just want the rules to be learnable. They don't understand what layers are doing. It's kind of that side. Then you have the intuition complainers, and they're like, this interaction doesn't make sense. It's not intuitive. It drives me nuts. What the heck? It's and like they want things to make sense, right? And so they are upset by this kind of interaction where if you if you turn into an elk, the Magus of the Moon, uh, then it's still the Magus of the Moon still works to shut off the lands and turn them into mountains. And uh, that interaction doesn't make sense. Players complain about that. So you get players complaining from both sides here, right? So the people say the rules are too complicated. Why can't we just have this always, work the correct way or whatever? But not have to learn all of these complicated, weird layers things. And then the intuition people being like, oh my god, these situations don't make sense. So you have these like very conflicting views of things that people complain about, where the more you try to fix the intuition situations by lowering the generalizations, by adding more fine-grained rules to kind of account for those things, then the more complex the rules get and the more the complexity complainers complain, right? And then the more you simplify the rules to make it really easy to understand, the more kind of corner cases that aren't intuitive kind of slip in. And so you have to find the balance between those things. There's no possible way to make both of these people happy at the same time. And so then it kind of comes to this weird situation where we basically need completeness, right? I don't think most of us would be very happy with a situation where we didn't have answers to what an interaction was supposed to be, because that doesn't feel fair. That leaves it to the judge to then have to make up the rules of the game rather than just like, making rulings based on like mistakes that people have made. And that seems very bad. So I think that completeness is probably the thing we probably don't want to compromise on. And so we just have to end up balancing these intuitive things and these learnable things. And learnability is basically coming down to complexity. And ultimately, this balance is going to shift. It's going to shift to account for new mechanics. So we add more complexity to the rules when new mechanics come to be. Big improvements sometimes happen, or big changes that. So, for example, we had that change to layers a couple years ago. Um, or the change. I think there was a change to layers a couple years ago that was pretty minor, but it ended up fixing some things. We had the change to replacement effects that changed how I think it was I don't remember the exact ruling, but we've had some recent changes. Yeah, so yeah, Isaac, that. Um Yeah, because it covered mutate, that's right. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, so when we have new mechanics, we have changes to the rules. Things kind of change to improve to account for the new mechanics. Sometimes we get like quality of life improvements where something changes, and all obviously the rules of Magic have changed quite a bit over the time, right? So the stack came to be at one point, and that was a pretty big change, but it ended up being a change that they thought was positive for intuition, and it ended up working out. Um, yeah, and so what's interesting is, though, that you have to take into account the fact that these big sweeping changes, they actually hurt both intuitive and learnable, at least temporarily, right? Because people are used to the old way that it works, and then they have to learn new things, right? And so the reason why I point that out is because sometimes it's worth it for those things to happen, but a lot of times when you're talking about the rules with someone, and you can get to this point where they understand that there needs to be a balance between intuitive and learnable, or like complexity, but then they say, well, a whole new system that's totally different would have like solved all of these problems and just been better generally. But you have to remember that you're working from what you're working on. Um, you have to understand that, you know, we have an existing game and an existing set of rules. And so just saying, well, we could throw this out and come up with a completely new system, that's not going to be intuitive or learnable. So we have to kind of work with shifting the balance in what we have. The comp rules can't just be like suddenly completely different rules that work completely differently, because, like I said, that's bad for all of these different reasons. And yeah, so does that kind of make sense? It's kind of a framework for thinking about how the comp rules work and how they kind of fit together. Um, because I think that once you understand this, then instead of just saying, oh, that's just the way it works, you can kind of think about, well, why does it work that way? So people go, layers are too complicated, layers are stupid. Well, why does it work that way? Well, they actually do quite a lot to make interactions more intuitive. Okay, great. And then, you go to other things like, you know, God, this little stupid corner case interacting drives me nuts. It's not intuitive. What happens here? Why is this like this? And then the, reaction to that can be, well, you know, because it doesn't make a huge difference to games, and because maybe this is intuitive in different ways to different people, it was not worth adding the complexity of an entire separate rule to the comprehensive rules just for this interaction. And it's not covered by the other things. Well, okay, so that kind of explains why you get to that point. So there you go. So yeah. So the next thing we're going to talk about is policy. And policy has some very different uh, kind of mechanics and things behind it that I think really inform the philosophy here. So the first thing we have to understand with policy is what the overarching goal is. So with the comp rules, the overarching goal is really obvious, right? It's just a system for figuring out what happens when you're playing this game. How does this game work? What do the interactions do? Policy is really different, and I think it's a little more nuanced. So what policy is trying to do is it's trying to do, well, kind of a few things, but the very core of it is that it's trying to negate the potential of advantage for problems that occur. So it's trying to, make sure people are not getting advantage from mistakes or even things they do on purpose. And then it's also trying to make sure that rulings are consistent across tournaments. And so negating the advantage, lots and lots of things kind of go into that, right? So the fixes in policy go to that goal. Some of the deterrence effects in policy go to that goal. Just the tracking even of warnings go to that. Then the second part of that, making sure that rulings are consistent, that's just kind of what the existence of policy does, right? Make sure that we have consistent rulings across tournaments. And so policy also has some interesting interacting bits. And so when we think about what we need policy to be, we kind of have some different things. So first of all, that we have completeness again, maybe, but we'll talk a little bit more about why that's a little bit goofier for policy than it is for the comp rules. Uh, we also need the IPG to be consistent and precise, and we'll talk about defining those in just a moment. So first thing is completeness here, and so it turns out that initially you think, oh, we definitely need it to be complete. We need policy to be able to answer for whatever happens. But ultimately, that's not really feasible. And the reason for that is that the comp rules are covering game interactions. And while there are a ridiculously large number of game interactions, as we talked about earlier, it's all within the system of the game. And so everything is at least like you can account for it, basically, uh, because you're only talking about the system within this game, which is in itself like a system. Policy is talking about human behavior. It's talking about all the things the human might do wrong or goofy or screw up. And it's just actually an infinite space. The rules are a very, very large finite space. You still have a lot of challenge there. But policy, it's not just, oh, I have to figure out what to do when this interaction goes wrong, like rules interaction goes wrong. Policy also needs to tell you what to do if, to be complete, it would need to have an actual prescribed fix for like a person has cartwheeled through the middle of your tournament and destroyed many board states and some cards. And like, while policy right now kind of gestures at those things, having like specific fixes for all of this that would account for like all of the different things you might do to try to remedy a crazy thing like that. Like what happens if the building burns down? Like you just can't have policy have real answers to all of these things. Uh, it's just not going to be possible, right? So completeness, while very attractive, is not something we're going to focus on to be should be identical for any players and all tournaments. And so that means that if I am playing in a PTQ in Pittsburgh and the exact same problem happens to, my friend Steve in California at a Magic Fest, within the game, of course, so the same situation, the ruling should be the same. Steve shouldn't call me later and be like, oh my God, this happened, and then this was the result. And me go, well, why? That was completely different. And the reason for that is fairness, right? We want our policy to be fair to all players, and we'll talk a little bit more later about why that's so important. Someone says their dog ate my deck. Yeah, I feel that. My dog probably would eat my deck. I have a new doggy. Uh, So yeah, and then the last thing we need in policy is precision. So being precise. The rules for policy. So the rulings need to make sense for the particular infractions they cover. So they need to uh, essentially be pinpoint accurate to the infractions and like the situations that they're covering. And so this is not about the judge being able to precisely rule correctly based on policy. That's actually more of a consistency thing, making sure that judges can consistently follow the policy. This is about it's very similar to being intuitive, but you'll see why I'm talking about it slightly differently. It's making sure that you don't have these like giant blanket policies that are causing problems. Okay, so let's say that consistency is king, and all you care about is consistency, and precision can go out the window. We don't care about it. Uh, so this would end up with what is essentially a coarse policy. So we're going to talk about coarse versus fine-grained here. And so this policy is going to have really easy to understand policy in order to ensure consistency, right? That means that everyone who reads it can just immediately understand what's going on. Um, very few rules to remember because otherwise people would maybe forget them and be less consistent, right? There would be no subjective judgment, no investigation, because that would just add subjectivity and inconsistency to policy. That's bad. We don't want that. Ew. Every fix would be extremely simple, requiring no judgment whatsoever. So basically, if something goes wrong, the player gets a game loss, is an example of a policy that would be really, really consistent, a really coarse policy. Yeah, we could definitely finish tournaments in time if we did this. But this doesn't feel fair, right? Who would want to play in a tournament where the second something goes wrong, whether it's advantageous for you or not, game loss? So like I forget my own static ability that is good for me, game loss. I miss a trigger that's good for me, game loss. It's just gone. Nobody wants that, right? It's just not a good policy. But that's what you get if you only consider consistency and you don't consider precision at all. So let's say that precision is king and we don't care about consistency, throw it out the window. Well, this would be a maximally fine-grained policy. So you'd have a ton of flexibility handling situations. You would need to have a lot of judgment about intent, about what people decide, because ultimately, if someone is doing something and they intend to do something wrong, but or even if they intend to do something like for slightly different reasons, even if it's not even between like cheating and not cheating, even if it's just you know the reason why they made this mistake, either they were distracted versus they didn't understand what the card did, maybe those would be ruled differently to be completely fair. It would negate every advantage very specifically. It would take into account all the board states, all the hands, all the decisions, all the information, any available information, including like videos, including like someone outside was taking a selfie near the board state and maybe you could like see one card there. All of it should be taken into consideration. It requires the judge to investigate absolutely perfectly. And ultimately, this kind of boils down to apply the fix that is most fair when something goes wrong. Well, that seems good, except that, it would lead to a lot of crazy rulings, right? And every ruling would take a very, 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 very long time. So that seems bad, right? We don't necessarily want every ruling to take a really long time. And like the level of inconsistency here is going to be so high that players would have no idea what to expect when they call the judge. And if a judge is better than another judge at like figuring out what's going on, they're going to come up with this completely different situation. And that seems bad. It seems like you're going to run into some problems here. It's not a very usable policy. Yeah. And so ultimately, you need a balance because without consistency, you get players who are getting different rulings for the exact same situation at different events. Judges are going to have to insert their opinions about what happened and how much advantage was gained so much more than they do with how policy actually is. The rulings would be really, really vulnerable to bias. So implicit and explicit bias. So you could have a judge who is actually just favoring someone, or you could have a judge who is just trying to figure out what someone's intent is. Whether they just got distracted or they don't understand what the card does, if it was like a true misunderstanding or just not paying attention. Maybe those things need to be treated differently, and the judge has a lot of bias about that just based on who the player is. Maybe they're short, maybe they're young, maybe they're a girl, maybe they're a minority. And the judge has no idea they have this implicit bias because that's unconscious, and this would be super vulnerable to that. It also requires perfect judges, which is kind of a problem, right? We don't actually have perfect judges. Not a single judge in the program is perfect. And you just need literally omnipotent judges to make this work really well. But then without the precision, you end up with rulings that don't at all match the infractions that they're delivered for. So you end up with like game losses for missing, a trigger that did nothing except like, tap and then untap a creature that does nothing or something stupid, right? We don't want that. It's like a very gotcha environment. It's a very miserable environment. And yeah, someone says soul sister triggers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we don't want that. Game loss for out of order sequencing. Well, yeah, not great. So then judges can't consider extenuating circumstances in this case to make a better ruling, which is kind of ridiculous and bad. The game states are never going to be fixable, right? It's just always a game loss. You can't have it be like always a warning, because then like what do you do with the game state? Sometimes it's not really playable from there. So it has to just be like very concrete, like game loss, game loss, game loss. Or if you really want to do warnings, you could like warnings forever and restart the game and see how long your tournament takes if you do that. Yeah, and so that doesn't require judges because it's just a very blanket policy. But man, that sounds awful. Like you're not going to get a lot of fairness. It's going to be a really bad situation. So bad. And ultimately, there are some examples of policy changes in the actual wild that are kind of showing you what's happening with this balance. So over time in policy, we've mostly been changing in favor of precision over consistency. And there's a whole bunch of examples of that. So a few years back, we had drawing extra cards. Drawing extra cards, always a game loss. Pretty simple. You had to get approval to give the game loss, and then, there was no fix because it was always a game loss. This transition to hidden card air, and hidden card air is a lot more complicated to fix, right? It is so many more things in the rules. It is a lot to remember. It's something that, we need you need to get at like a Magic Fest, you'd need to get like a L3 or a team lead involved to make sure you're doing it right. It's so much more complicated and so much easier to end up with a situation that's not totally consistent. But the reason why policy changed that way is because the benefit of precision, so being able to fix those situations without just nuking the game with a game loss, is worth the change in consistency, essentially. And that's kind of the way that policy in general has been going for quite a long time. So you kind of expect that. So someone's saying, Turn 1 Goblin Guide attack moves. Oh, interesting. I think people are still going on about the restarting games a lot thing. But yeah, so policy in general has been changing in favor of precision. It also used to be the case with deck list problem. Like any issue with your deck list used to be a DQ way back in the day. Then it went to deck list problem, which was pretty much always a game loss. And then more recently, it actually split into two separate infractions, deck problem and deck list problem. And very often, those are going to be a warning with a fix, or they're going to upgrade to a game loss. And so there's a lot more different outcomes here. You're able to be more precise to come with a better situation to individual circumstances and things. But the thing that's kind of interesting about that, right, is that along with those benefits, the benefits of being more fair, you also get the detriments, right, of these are not going to be applied in exactly the same way. There are a lot of situations that maybe it's kind of not super obvious what the fix is. And so a lot of the judges end up getting those wrong. A lot of judges maybe there are situations that are actually ambiguous and they'll come up with different solutions from each other. And so you do end up with a reduction of consistency there as well. And even improperly determining a winner, which used to just be a straight up DQ, no questions asked pretty much, to, sometimes it's a match loss if they didn't necessarily understand what's going on. They didn't understand that they were doing something wrong. All of these things are going to lead to games that have, on average, like more fairness, more precision in the policy, but less consistency and more rulings that you'll find that people have ruled differently in, different situation, in the same situation in different tournaments. And so when you hear, policy is dumb, you should deviate, right? This is something that you hear quite a bit. It's important to consider the balance here. So the head judge can deviate in really exceptional circumstances for the IPG, but there's a reason why the IPG generalizes. There's a reason why it doesn't just let you do whatever you want in every possible situation. And that reason is because consistency is also important. And I think at one point, I don't want to misquote him, but I believe that, Toby Elliott, who has written a bunch of policy, said that, if he, like, who's like writing all of this policy, were the only person, just lots of clones of him, right, were judging these tournaments, everything would just be like regular IL. He would just like come up with the most fair situation in every case. The reason why we have policy is that it's not just clones of all one person with really good judgment about the game. It's, all kinds of different judges, and we need to have some consistency and some predictability about what is going to happen when something goes wrong in the name of fairness, to make sure that there's no bias, to make sure that players know what to expect. It's all really important to having a good competitive game. Yeah, so I finished a little bit earlier than I expected to, but yeah, so you have situations like this, and my hope with this presentation is that you'll come away from this and you'll see these conversations that people try to instigate, where it's rules are dumb, policy is dumb, here's this thing that I take issue with. And what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to look at those situations and see why things are the way they are. And obviously, that doesn't mean that every single thing in policy is perfect. I have things in policy that I don't like and I wish they would change. I think most people who have been around Magic, been around policy for a decent amount of time, have those things. And sometimes, there are things that really will. They'll be incorporated later on. And that's really important. And like some of those ideas are good ideas, and eventually, maybe they'll get added to policy. But what I'm hoping is that when you're in those situations and you have those scenarios, that you'll understand why it is the way it is, and then you can have an actual engaging conversation of, well, is this a situation that is so severe that it needs to be pulled out separately? Is the consistency not worth the hit? Same with the rules and policy in this case. I'm hoping that this generates more nuanced conversations about this and kind of helps you think about why the rules and policy are the way they are. So yes, Q&A time is good. Happy to take any questions that people have. Sorry that we went a little faster than expected. If I can make one change to policy, what would it be and why? That's a really hard question, actually. I think that the thing that bothers me the most about policy currently is the mistrigger policy. There's some very weird edges of it that I think are really feel bad for players. So like one anecdote is my very first tournament ever, just like a random F&M or whatever. It was a draft. I missed a trigger. I had no idea what I was doing. And after the game, my opponent said like, "Oh, hey, you missed this trigger in the future. You should remember that. That would be good for you," which is fine. And then another game went by, and I saw that my opponent missed what ended up being a static ability, but I had no idea what it was. And I didn't call it out. At the end of the game, I pointed out I still got my butt kicked that game, right? As a new player, I had no idea what was going on. And they were super upset that I didn't tell them about it at the time. They're like, "You're not allowed to do that." And the judge explained that I wasn't allowed to do that. And I was so confused because why would it be okay to not point out a trigger or this thing that I didn't even know it was called a trigger? I had no idea what it was, and then not point out a stack ability. Like, it just leads to these ridiculous feel bads because it's treated differently. Yeah, so I really, really don't like that. It also there's lots of weirdness about being able to put things on the stack in places they're not supposed to go. So like later in the turn, there's weird things like, for example, with Duskwatch Recruiter, where you can gain information, then put the trigger on the stack and then respond to things. Uh, I don't really like the way that works. I would rather see missed triggers treated as a GRV, but then we just don't back up for beneficial ones, or not generally detrimental ones. But that's just me. I don't want to go too super deep on this. It's a complicated thing, and I understand that. I understand why the missed trigger policy is the way it is because it's so easy to miss them, and it's very disruptive to have those treated as GRV if you don't add something about making them still missable if they're not. Yeah, it's just a really quagmire of a situation, but I think it's really rough on new players right now. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, so someone said, "What's your favorite recent policy change?" I think so. I'm a really big fan of hidden card air. I started out judging competitive REL when there was still drawing extra cards. It was only around for a little bit before I started, before hidden card air came about, from the time I started judging at competitive REL. And I really like that hidden card error lets you not game loss people, because I had a couple situations where I had to give game losses for things that really didn't feel like they should be. Like, for example, like drawing a card too early because they thought their opponent passed the turn and they hadn't. Like, I had a couple situations like that that felt really bad because there was just no way to fix the situation, and it was just awful. And so I really like hidden card air that lets you kind of fix these things a lot less disruptively. I think it's good that it's kind of changed over time. I think the original iteration of it kind of had some really difficult holes in the fixes, but I think it's in a pretty good place right now. Yeah, lots of gotchas with it as well. I agree. And I would also really encourage everybody here that if you find this interesting and you enjoy talking about rules and policy, find the opportunity to have these discussions with people, because there's no way that I would understand the rules or the policy as well as I do without just talking to a lot of people about it. I find it super interesting, and you'll see that different people have really different perspectives. It's so helpful to talk to people who have different perspectives. It informs your understanding of things. It informs your views of things. Yeah. So someone's saying, what policy do you feel is worst understood and most often misapplied? I think that's USC minor. There are a lot of situations where people say, well, I don't think that's worth a USC minor, when someone does something that's like problematic but not like kick out of the tournament a bowl. But actually that's what USC minor is for. So like, for example, if someone's like just not following directions, you've told them to do something multiple times, they don't do it, please go ahead and give them that warning. Like, there's a reason that exists. It's not like, if they're doing something that's bad enough that they need to get kicked out of the venue, it's not USC minor at all. So I think there's a lot of like confusion. People feel really bad about giving USC penalties but USC minor is much less severe than people think it is and should be applied more. Someone says, what would you say is the best course of action if judging at competitive REL and we come across some situation which might not be covered by current policy? So I would say that if you are a floor judge, you obviously want to go to the head judge. So if this is like a Magic Fest, because a lot of times the like GP head judge group and the people who are like doing those large events, they have, chats and discussions about things that might come up all the time. And so they may already have come to an understanding about what to do in that situation. If you, and it just hasn't made it into policy, they're still testing it out, things along those lines. If you're judging on your own and that happens, I would say that you should try to apply policy the best you can. If it really truly doesn't fit anything in policy, like it's truly exceptional, like your table blew over from the wind or something like that, just come up with the most fair fix that you can. And ultimately, that's what the deviation thing is for, right? It's that policy can't cover every single situation. And yeah, so I would say that, obviously we said we can't have policy that's completely complete. It's just impossible. So definitely recommend that. Someone's saying, given the way Magic players tend to talk, I'm surprised I've never seen USC minor in the wild. You probably have, and it just hasn't been issued a warning, right? If someone is talking in a way that's going to like make people super uncomfortable, you ask them to stop and they say, and give some more swears or whatever, or you see them doing it later, that's still USC minor. Like it's that simple. Until you can't and then use best judgment. Yeah, like obviously you're going to run into situations sometimes. It's really rare. I've only had to deviate a few times ever where something really didn't feel like it fit into policy at all. It's very, very unusual. Oh, okay. So someone else boosted a question that I missed. Oh, sorry. What was the last time you deviated? If you did, that is, and would you do it again? Interesting. I am trying to remember the last time that I deviated now. Yeah, so there was a very strange situation that that involved cards like falling on the floor, like into a backpack, basically. That there was really no good way to figure that out. I don't remember the exact situation, but policy really didn't cover it very well. And I ended up consulting. I was the head judge at that event, but I consulted with another really, really experienced judge who was working it. And we ultimately had to deviate to come to a solution. It was in the first like turn of the game. And I think we ended up just dumping that game because both players ended up with cards on the floor in someone's backpack. And that was just too weird. But yeah, there were a couple other times I've deviated, I'm sure. But very rarely is it I don't like the answer that policy gives. It's usually there is no answer that policy gives. I don't know that I've ever deviated just because I didn't like what it said. Although I will say that there are judges who do deviate sometimes in like very specific situations. Things like Chalice of the Void, where again the mistrigger policy has failed us. And it doesn't fix the thing that it needs to fix, right? And so there are judges who will deviate then to try to actually fix that situation. Someone says, has it ever been CPV? Yeah, it's actually CPV like relatively frequently. It's just something that doesn't get identified very easily. It definitely has been CPV sometimes, though, especially, with the newly defined CPV. It's like pretty easy to find. It's this kind of situation where you're like, oh, how many cards do you have in your hand? Gives answer, goes to cast a spell. Oh, wait, actually, I was wrong about that count. That kind of situation actually happens all the time. It's just that a judge doesn't always get called in those situations necessarily. But When they do, hopefully it gets identified accurately as a CPV. PCV, that's probably before my time if it I'm not super familiar with that abbreviation, so. Yeah, I think that's before my time. Yeah. So for me, it has never been a PCV. It's definitely been CPV plenty of times. All right. I'm happy to take more questions if people have them, but this is the start of, I think, your break time. So if you want to take your break, by all means, do so. Thank you all so much. If anyone wants to chat more, feel free to message me on Discord or on Facebook. I really hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any feedback for me about the presentation, this is an article that I wrote by myself. Not a lot of people read it. Turned it into a presentation. This is the first time I've given it. So if you have any feedback on the presentation, I really want to get it as useful as it can be for helping people understand this. I really hope it's enjoyable.